Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Face to Face with me, Azad Ali. This week we're looking at the assassination of Soleimani, the Iranian general, and also Middle East politics. What is the state of the Middle East in political terms? In the studio, I have Nasim Ahmed, who's a political analyst for Memo, to discuss this and more. So, the killing of Soleimani. A lot of people are calling it an assassination. America is saying it was a necessary evil that needed to be taken out. What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, looking at some of the details that's come out into how the US got to the decision about killing Soleimani, I don't think they thought it through, the implications of killing someone so high profile. One narrative, one account is that, he was offered a number of options and how to respond to the embassy siege, which is exactly on the time, I don't know if you remember, there was an embassy siege and Trump had to respond to the embassy siege. And I think in his mind, he was thinking, we don't want another Benghazi situation where in 2012, as you remember, the embassy was sieged and the US ambassador was killed. And that had a massive impact on Clinton's chance of winning the 2016 election. So I think that was playing in Trump's mind. And I think he wanted to demonstrate, we're not going to go this way. I'm going to, take a firm stance. So when he was given a number of options, he selected the most extreme one, thinking that this will make him look good. And I think ever since that killing, they've tried to create a narrative, a story as to why they had to take out Soleimani the way they did, justified, because there's no justification, because there was no immediate threat to the US. Even the Pentagon came out and said, no, we did not have any evidence to suggest that there was an immediate threat posed by Soleimani. So that's the case. In the end, Trump tweeted something like, okay, there was no immediate threat, but so what? Honestly, he basically said, so what? What does it matter? We've taken out a bad guy.
So what is basically, is it not an act of war? Is that not an act of war?
In any definition of what constitutes an act of war, it's an act of war, because you've taken out someone who was in Iraq, really, from what we know, to negotiate the actual embassy withdrawal, taking militias and militants who were besieging the embassy. So he was trying to negotiate that and also negotiate a deal between the Iranians and the Saudis. That's also the other narrative. So that being the case, he's there under the safety of the Iraqis. Okay, and to take someone out when US, you're also at the behest of the Iraqis. You're in the Iraqi territory. So given that's the case, that is clearly a war crime, clearly constitutes a breach of international law, and the Iraqis have responded. They responded by voting within the parliament to say the Americans have to withdraw.
America rejected that, which kind of it's ironic. You're in another country saying, they invited us and we need to be there, and they say, no, we don't need you no more. Can you go? And say, no, we're not going to go. And I think there was a really big demonstration and everything else. Lots of people calling for American withdrawal. So they bluntly said no. So what happens now?
So the parliament rejected it. But the American line is that the government has not told us to leave. So the government hasn't authorized us to leave. The vote was really a non-binding vote. And the Sunni MPs, the Kurdish MPs, abstained. They did not vote. So there's a broader issue at play here in Iraq, which is that the Sunni communities, they do fear for the consequences of what would happen if the Americans leave. So a number of Sunni MPs who had abstained, they actually left the country thinking they may be targeted for not voting with the Iraqis. So there's that wider consideration. And essentially what the game in town at the moment is that if there is pressure on the Americans to leave, I think there would be calls for the Americans to relocate in Kurdish region, in the Sunni sections, and which we may see the beginning of a breakup of Iraq. I mean,
I think that, the point you're coming to, I think a lot of people looking from outside, that they think it was a simple thing. Iraqi sovereignty was trampled on as a war crime to kill Soleimani, no matter what he's done or whatever. and Americans should leave. But actually, the situation in Iraq is far more complicated. The Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shias, and everything else. Like so, this when Saddam Hussein was taken out and the country practically destroyed, if you like, there was a lot of discussion that it is going to split, and there will be almost like a three-way split. Is this really now becoming the reality?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, that the proposal to split Iraq has always been on the cards, especially since 2003, failure of the Americans to keep a united Iraq, and it's taken out, and it's taken out for the draw again because the Sunni Iraqis do not feel safe. I've spoken to a number of Iraqis. This is what they feel. They feel that they would be safer under the American oversight than they would under Iraqis who are aligned to Iran. So that's the reality of things on the ground. So if and Iraqi constitution allows for many of the Sunnis and the Kurds, the major minority groups, to become a self-governing entity. Right. So if they wish for that, I don't see how. And if they have the might of the Americans behind them, if they have an international coalition of countries willing to recognize their cessation from Iraq, so you have all the ingredients at play. A might of the Americans, legitimacy and recognition by an international group of countries. Do
you think that would be beneficial for Iraqis overall to split the country?
If we go to the structure of what makes states succeed and fail, Iraq, as we know, was an artificial construct in the first place. So I would say it was inevitable that a country with three large minorities coming together, and it was always going to face these kind of difficulties. Any strain.
But people would argue, if you go back to say the time when Saddam Hussein was ruling, if you go back to the Iraq-Iran war. Largely speaking, there was a united Iraq. The Kurds actually fought, and the Sunnis fought with Saddam against the Iranians, and a lot of the Shias actually fought against Iran as well during that time. That being the case, do you think the sectarian game that is being played here, is that going to be beneficial for any of those sects? Would it be beneficial for the Kurds to be a small entity at the dependence of America, the Sunnis, a small entity dependence on America, the Shias, a small entity dependent on Iran? Where's the benefit?
In the long term, there is no benefit. But if you look back at the way Saddam managed to unite the country, keep the country together, people will say he did it through a lot of brutality and violence. And one of the reasons for states remaining together, even if they have a large ethnic minorities, different ethnic groups pulling in their different ways, what brings them together is a foreign threat. Foreign threats usually bring countries together, is really the way states are formed, And Iran was seen as an enemy, a major enemy which needed to be dealt with. So it allowed for Saddam Hussein to exploit the situation. There's a bigger threat in our region. We need to fight against the Iranian Revolution. It's going to, there's going to be a wave of people who want to overthrow our country, destroy our self-determination and rights. So with that fear, I think it enabled the country to come together. Right. But when you have the likes of the Americans who came in and exploited the sectarianism within the country and just began to rule the country, set up a parliament which encouraged sectarianism. The logical conclusion of that would be these ethnic groups wanting to go their own way, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. Because they don't feel safe under the umbrella of an Iraq which the Sunnis and the Kurds view to be under the influence of Iran. And that's hard to deny because within especially the military forces, you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers, Hashtag-Shab, the popular mobilization forces, which fought and pushed back ISIS, Daesh. They have now been, they're now part of the Iraqi army. And they don't answer to the Iraqi parliament. They answer to the Ayatollah in Iran. So that's another consideration which is fueling this desire to separate.
I mean, when you think about the politics that is being played, if we just put the sectarianism aside, just looking at it from an economic perspective and resource-wise, Iraq is a oil-rich country. It was actually before the war. It was actually one of the richest countries, and people were living a really affluent and decent life. When all of these things are being pushed through, how are they going to manage the economic and the resources? I mean, who will get what? Isn't that going to be another war?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, Iraq, Egypt, all the countries that are on the brink of collapse, you can say, failed states in some ways, they have everything going for them in terms of prosperity. They have enough resource, they have enough, a population, highly intelligent, educated middle class. They could actually flourish as a country. For whatever reason, these countries have, I would say, been made to fail. There are bigger games at play in terms of interest of the US, interest of the West and Israel, which doesn't somehow. The conclusion which you have to reach is that there's a gain in having these countries constantly fighting, failing, splitting into fragmented parts, and this serves a different interest.
All right, hold that thought, because I think we are coming up to a break, and I want to take that discussion up a little bit further. So do join us after the break, inshallah. See you soon. Welcome back to Face to Face with me, Azad Ali. So just before the break, I mean, you were saying there's a interest to keep countries like Iraq, countries like Egypt, and others in the Middle East felt that the natural resources, the people, the population is a very intelligent population. It's a very middle class. It's a very able population, and it can definitely have a successful state. I mean, this is something that a lot of people have said. I've heard in many other conversations as well, and not to get into conspiracy theory. How do you keep a state failed? I mean, just as how do you make a successful state? There's things you need to do. What do you think are the things people are doing or deploying or not doing that is helping to maintain a state of failure, if I can say that?
I think one answer to that would be to militarize the countries, have constant conflicts. And that is exactly what we've seen in Iraq in particular. Saddam Hussein, yes, he had an amazing, you could say in some sense, an amazing vision to educate the Iraqis. Most of the Middle Eastern countries, they had so many Iraqi doctors. Iraqi doctors were everywhere. They were educating the whole of the Middle East in some ways. He had massive infrastructure projects. So the country, you could say, was, in terms of vision, was heading the right way. But the way to make a state fail, first of all, I think, is to have a state formed on foundations which are not amenable to success. So when you have an artificial construct like Iraq, when you have strong minorities pulling the different ways, which is exactly what was the case in Palestine, we had strong minorities. You had the Palestinians, were the indigenous communities who constituted, when Palestine was split, 65%, and a very large Jewish minority. When you have large minorities with their own political vision, they don't see a stake. They don't feel they have their voice has been heard, and they have a stake within the country. That's when you have splits, and Iraq is a classic example. The Kurds have never felt part of the Iraq. They've always been part of the Kurdistan. And Sunnis, there was a period within under Saddam Hussein where I think they could have lived under a united Iraq. But because of the sectarianism, because of foreign interference, because of Iraq wanting to influence, have Iraq as a vassal state. The Sunnis, they're not a small group.
What about Egypt? I mean, we had, the whole movement of the people, the protests and everything else, the change in government, removal of Mubarak, a democratically elected president, and now we're back to basically same place. I mean, how is that?
So for countries like Egypt, Iraq, there's a concept in political theory, which is many of these countries are rentier states. They can survive without the consent of their population. Democracies need the consent of the population, but these countries don't need the consent of the population. They can survive. Why? Because they serve a wider interest, which is maintaining security for the US, for Israel, or because they are sitting on large oil wealth, as in the case with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Gulf countries, where they can use that oil wealth to serve Western markets, Western interests. They don't really need taxes from their community and their countries. So you have an elite within the country, decision makers within the country. They are completely detached from their constituencies in order to survive as an entity, as a country. So when you have that kind of scenario within the Middle East, every country is more or less like that, apart from Tunisia, which is why Tunisia has succeeded, and you can say it's evolved into one of the democratic success within the Middle East.
From the Arab Spring, the only one that's survived.
And every other country, they are what you would call a rentier state. Either they serve a huge strategic interest.
Do you think when the Arab Spring did happen and all of that kind of, do you think there was a drive to go and fix everything in one go and not actually gradually bring the change? Because the thing I noticed with Tunisia is like the change was very gradual. It was very engaging. The people were always consulted. Like nothing happened until everyone had a vote or a say in which direction it goes. To the constitution, to local engagement, everything. Whereas when you look at maybe Egypt, or if you look at in other places, it wasn't necessarily like that.
That's absolutely true. Tunisia had an educated middle class. Their military was very weak. The relationship between the state and the military is different from the relationship between the state and the military in Egypt. Egypt is the military and the state, one and the same thing. Tunisia is not like that. Syria is the same thing. The regime and the military is one and the same thing. So as soon as you attack the regime, there's an existential crisis for the regime. We will be annihilated. So they react in a really brutal way. Tunisia is not the case. An attack on the regime is not an attack on the military. It's not one and the same thing. So that distinction is really important. Tunisia, for whatever reason, historically in its formation, it's managed to do that. But Egypt isn't like that. Egypt serves a greater strategic purpose because of Suez historically, because of Suez. And Suez is one of the reasons why the West supported the creation of Israel, to allow for the protection of Western interest in the region. So Egyptian interest, or the elite of Egypt, their interest has always been to serve a different interest. So they are what you call a rentier state. They are providing assistance and service to some.
I mean, if you just look at another country, Libya, for example, civil war and everything else. I mean, Libya is also a failed state at the moment. I mean, and there's actually a civil war taking place as we speak, or it probably never stopped.
Yeah.
I mean, so how are people, deriving lessons from this? Because you've got obviously what's happening in Syria at the moment. Then you had the rise of Daesh, which actually kind of it was like throwing a
Yeah, so I think the biggest
cat amongst the pigeons.
Yeah, the biggest lesson I think, in hindsight, that we could derive is that regimes in the Middle East have to wake up. They have to manage change in the region. They have to promise a better future, like bin Salman is promising everything, promising so much. But they have to manage that change. If they don't manage that change, the nature of their formation. If it's uncontrolled change, it would lead to the kind of bloodshed we've seen in Syria, we've seen in Iraq. The vacuum will always be filled by something that probably isn't as good as what we have at the moment. Tunisia is an exception, for various reasons. So I think that the biggest lesson is to, manage the change. So the countries like Egypt will not be allowed to collapse. It will not be allowed to fail because of the strategic interest it serves. It's a country of 70 million population. But these countries are realizing we have to have some kind of an economic program. We have to provide the basic needs of our population. And unless they set up programs to be able to do that, bin Salman has recognized that Saudi is on a path to falling falling off the cliff. And that is why he's installed a lot of these changes. Of course, his governance has been quite brutal, but I think there's a recognition that we cannot just rely on our oil wealth, and we need to offer jobs to the huge swelling youth population in the Middle East. So those recognition that the Middle East somehow has to change its course, that's accepted. So unless they find a way to cater to the needs of the population and become less and less a rentier state, which is looking out for the interests of foreigners.
Do you think that this need to develop your own states and provide a better future, or at least plan for a better future, is also perhaps taking people's eye off maybe like things like Palestine and everything else? I need to look after myself. Sorry, I can't help you at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even if you look at your own life, if you face an existential threat, whether that be in the form of having lost your job, being under some kind of threat to your life, you wouldn't be thinking about some of the other broader issues. And I think that there's a sense within the Middle East, especially after the Arab Spring, that the regimes at least are facing an existential threat. Yeah. And the way they've reacted, it's been quite brutal. And Palestine has dropped off the agenda. For the Gulf regimes, in particular the UAE and the Saudis anyway, they need Israeli support in intelligence and technology, which is why they want to normalize relationships. So even though the peace process, there isn't a resolution to the Palestinian conflict up to as of now, they are stretching their hands. They are working with the Israelis behind the scene, because you will not have Vision 2030 without the support of the Israelis and the Americans, and they recognize that.
We're coming to the end. Do you think there's a shift? There was a time when the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and others, played a pivotal role in the politics of the Muslim world, if I can use that term. Lately, do you think there's a shift from that to more like, Turkey and Malaysia and other countries perhaps having a more of a prominent role in the world scene than the Saudis and others?
There'll always be a tension between who sits at the hierarchy of the Muslim world, because the Muslim world is so vast. Saudi Arabia, just by the fact that the Haramain and Makkah and Medina is there, I don't think you can push Saudi Arabia off the number of countries list who are influential. But Turkey, politically at least, it's seen as probably the only country able to safeguard some of the hopes and aspirations of Muslims. It's seen as really a vanguard, as a champion of Muslim causes. And Malaysia also is coming into that bracket. So although Malaysia may not be as powerful, as influential, the message that's coming out from the leader is something which Muslim can hope for. Turkey definitely has the muscle as well, and it's able to shape the region to its interest. Without Turkey, Qatar would have collapsed. Qatar would have been, by now, would have been under the control of the Saudis and the UAE. There would not have been a Qatar, I don't think. So Turkey has played, I would say, despite what's happening in Syria, a stabilizing role within the region. But because of Saudi, or because what they are symbolically to the Muslims, it will always be something which, that's why we want Saudi Arabia to succeed. We want Saudi Arabia to find a way out,
of course, it's the land of this problem.
Of course, of the mess it's found itself in.
Okay, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right. Jazakallah khair, Nasim. We have come to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed the program, inshallah. We will be carrying on further discussions next week, so join me then. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.